March 1662. A small village in Suffolk, England. The air is cold, the sky is grey, and inside a modest cottage, something impossible is happening. Two young girls are convulsing on the floor. Their bodies twist and arch in ways that shouldn't be possible. Their eyes roll back until only the whites show. And they're screaming, not words, but sounds that don't seem human. Guttural animal sounds that make everyone in the room take a step back in horror. Their names are Elizabeth and Deborah Pacy. They are 11 and 9 years old, and 3 days ago, they were perfectly normal children. Their father, Samuel Pacy, a respected merchant, kneels beside them, trying to hold them still, but they're impossibly strong. Elizabeth breaks free and runs to the corner, scratching at the walls, screaming that invisible hands are choking her. Deborah suddenly goes rigid, her mouth frozen open, and then she begins to vomit. But she's not vomiting food or bile. She's vomiting pins, iron pins, dozens of them, clattering onto the wooden floor, each one bent and twisted as if it had been inside her body for days. Samuel Pacy stares at the pins scattered at his feet. His hands are shaking. His mind is racing through every possible explanation. Illness, poison, a trick. But his daughters have been under constant watch. No one has fed them anything unusual. No one has been near them except family. And the pins keep coming. From Elizabeth now. She gags and spits, and out comes another handful of pins, and then nails. Rusty iron nails that couldn't possibly fit down a child's throat without tearing it apart. But there's no blood, no torn flesh, just metal, impossibly expelled from inside her body. The village doctor is called. He examines the girls, checks their throats, their stomachs. He finds nothing wrong, no natural explanation, no disease he recognizes. And then Elizabeth speaks, but it's not her voice. It's something else, something older, raspier, mocking. Amy Duny did this, the voice says through the child's mouth. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender, they sent us. They commanded us to torment these children, and we will not stop until they are dead. Samuel Pacy's blood runs cold. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender. Two old women from the village. Widows, poor, isolated. Women that people whispered about. Women that people crossed the street to avoid. Witches. And in Puritan England, in 1662, if your children are possessed by demons, and those demons name the witches who sent them, there is only one response. You call for the magistrate, you call for the church, you call for justice, and you prepare for a trial that will end in blood. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark chapters of history deserve to be remembered, if you think the horrors hidden in the past should be brought into the light, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows us to keep digging into the stories that history tried to bury. Tonight we enter the world of witch trials, not the famous ones in Salem, but an earlier case, a more brutal case, one that would set the template for the madness to come. We'll follow two elderly women from their quiet lives to their accusations, from their examination to their torture, from their trial to the gallows. This is not just a story about witches. It's about what happens when children become weapons, when fear becomes evidence, when an entire community turns on its most vulnerable members because the alternative, that demons are real and can strike anyone, is too terrifying to accept. This is the story of the Bury St. Edmunds Witch Trials, the case that proved demons walked among us, the case that sent 2 innocent women to their deaths based on the testimony of children who may have been lying, may have been ill, or may have truly been possessed by something that science still cannot explain. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand how 2 elderly women could be executed based on the testimony of vomiting children, you must first understand the England they lived in. This was 1662. The English Civil War had ended just over a decade ago, leaving the country traumatized and paranoid. King Charles I had been beheaded by his own people. Oliver Cromwell's Puritan government had ruled with an iron fist, banning theatre, dance, and anything resembling joy. Now Charles II was on the throne, but the Puritan mindset, the belief in absolute good and absolute evil, the obsession with sin and the devil, still gripped the population. This was a world where the supernatural was not fantasy. It was fact. Everyone, from the poorest farmer to the king himself, believed in witches. The Bible spoke of them. Exodus 22:18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It was right there, in Scripture, a direct command from God. Witches were not fairy tale villains. They were real threats. They could curse your crops, kill your livestock, make your children sick, cause impotence, spoil milk, summon storms. They made pacts with the devil, selling their souls in exchange for demonic power, and in return, they did the devil's work on earth, spreading misery, causing suffering, corrupting the innocent. The church taught that witches were everywhere, hiding in plain sight. They could be anyone. Your neighbor, your midwife, the old woman who lived alone at the edge of town. And if you suspected someone was a witch, it was your Christian duty to report them. Because if you didn't, if you stayed silent, their evil would spread. The demons they commanded would multiply, and their victims, including you, including your children, would suffer. This was the world Amy Duny and Rose Cullender lived in. A world where being old, being poor, being a woman without a husband's protection made you suspect. A world where one accusation could end your life. Lowestoft was a small fishing village on the eastern coast of England, in the county of Suffolk. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip travelled faster than the wind, and where strangers were viewed with suspicion. It was a hard life. The men went out to sea, risking their lives to bring back fish. The women worked from dawn to dusk, cooking, cleaning, raising children, tending gardens. Infant mortality was high, disease was common, life was uncertain, and when bad things happened, when children died, when crops failed, when sickness swept through the village, people needed someone to blame. Because the alternative was accepting that the world was random, cruel, and chaotic. And that was too terrifying. It was easier to believe in witches, because witches could be caught. Witches could be stopped. Witches gave suffering a face, a name, a target. Into this world of fear and suspicion lived 2 women who would become that target. Amy Duny was in her 60s, though no one knew her exact age. Record keeping was poor, especially for the lower classes, and Amy was decidedly lower class. She was a widow. Her husband had been a labourer, and when he died, he left her with nothing. No land, no money, no sons to provide for her. In the 17th century England, a woman without a man was in a precarious position. Amy survived by doing odd jobs, spinning wool, helping with harvests, taking in laundry. She begged occasionally, going door to door, asking for bread or coins. People gave sometimes, out of Christian charity, they said, but also out of fear, because Amy Duny had a reputation. She was strange. She muttered to herself. She kept to herself. When children teased her in the street, she would turn and glare at them with a look that made them run home crying. She had a sharp tongue and a quick temper. If someone refused to give her alms, she would curse under her breath and walk away, leaving the person feeling uneasy. And then sometimes bad things would happen to those people. A child would fall ill. A cow would stop giving milk. A fire would start in the barn. Coincidence, most likely. But in a world that believed in witches, coincidence looked a lot like a curse. Rose Cullender was older than Amy, probably in her early 70s. She too was a widow, living alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. But Rose had a skill that made her both valued and feared. She knew herbs. She knew remedies. When someone had a fever or a cough or a wound that wouldn't heal, they would sometimes come to Rose. She would give them a mixture of plants, a poultice, a tea. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. When it worked, people were grateful, but they were also suspicious. How did she know which plants to use? Where did that knowledge come from? Was it natural wisdom, passed down through generations? Or was it something darker? Had she learned her remedies from the devil himself? And when her treatments didn't work, when someone died despite her efforts, the whispers grew louder. Maybe she hadn't been trying to heal them. Maybe she had been sent to harm them. Maybe the illness itself was her doing, and the cure was just a way to deflect suspicion. Rose, like Amy, had a reputation. And in a small village, a reputation was everything. The two women were not friends. There's no evidence they even knew each other well. But they had one thing in common. They were old, they were poor, they were alone, and people were afraid of them. All they needed was an accusation. And in March of 1662, that accusation came. It began, as these things often do, with the death of a child. Dorothy Durrant was a young mother, wife of a local fisherman. She had an infant, a baby girl, just a few months old. The baby was sickly, weak, not thriving the way a healthy infant should. Dorothy was desperate. She had tried everything, prayers, different feeding methods, keeping the child warm. Nothing worked. The baby was wasting away. One day, Amy Duny came to Dorothy's door, begging for alms. Dorothy, exhausted and worried about her child, refused. She had nothing to spare, she said. Her own family was struggling. Amy Duny's face darkened. She muttered something under her breath. Dorothy would later testify that she couldn't quite hear the words, but they sounded angry, threatening, and she turned and walked away. That night, the baby began to have fits. She would scream and arch her back and go rigid, her tiny body convulsing. Her eyes would roll back. Her breathing would become shallow and ragged. The fits would last for minutes, then stop, leaving the infant pale and exhausted. Dorothy called for the local wise woman, who examined the child and shook her head. This was not a natural illness, she said. This was something else. The fits continued. Night after night, the baby would scream and convulse. And then, 6 weeks after Amy Duny had cursed them at the door, the baby died. Dorothy Durrent was grief-stricken, but her grief quickly turned to anger. She remembered Amy's visit. She remembered the muttered words. She remembered the look in the old woman's eyes. Amy Duny had done this. Amy Duny was a witch, and she had killed Dorothy's baby. Dorothy went to the village authorities and made a formal accusation. Amy Duny, she said, had bewitched her child. She had cursed the baby to death. The authorities listened, and they began to investigate. But one accusation, one dead baby, was not enough. Infant mortality was tragically common. It could have been natural causes. They needed more evidence, more victims, more proof. And then, in March of 1662, Elizabeth and Deborah Pacy began to vomit pins. Samuel Pacy's daughters were possessed. The entire village knew it within hours. People crowded outside the Pacy house, whispering, praying, staring at the windows as if they could see the demons inside. The girls' fits were getting worse. They would go silent for hours, unable to speak, as if their tongues had been stolen. Then they would suddenly scream and thrash, claiming invisible hands were choking them, burning them, stabbing them. And the pins kept coming, dozens of them, impossible to count. The doctor collected them in a bowl, examining each one, trying to understand how they could have gotten inside the girls' bodies. But the most terrifying part was what the girls said when they could speak. They described the witches. 2 old women, they said. One named Amy Duny, one named Rose Cullender. The women would appear in their room at night, in spectral form, accompanied by demons that looked like animals. A great black dog, a cat with glowing eyes, a toad as large as a man. The witches would command the demons to torment the girls, to choke them, to force pins down their throats, to steal their voices and their strength. Samuel Pacy listened to his daughter's testimonies and knew what he had to do. He was a respected man, a merchant with connections. He had the ear of the magistrate. He would bring charges. He would see these witches arrested, tried, and executed. Because if he didn't, if he allowed these demons to continue their work, his daughters would die. And after them, who knew how many other children would fall victim to Amy Duny and Rose Cullender's evil? The hunt for the witches had begun, and in the 17th century England, once you were accused of witchcraft, there was only one way the story could end: at the gallows. After the Pacy sisters began their fits, something strange happened in Lowestoft and the surrounding villages. Other children began to show similar symptoms. It started with Jane Bocking, the 10-year-old daughter of a local woman named Diana Bocking. Jane had always been a healthy, normal child. But a few days after the Pacy girls' possession became known, Jane began to experience fits of her own. She would suddenly go rigid, her body as stiff as a board. Her mother and neighbors would try to bend her arms or legs, but it was impossible. It was as if her joints had been locked in place by some invisible force. Then, just as suddenly, she would collapse, limp and unresponsive. When she could speak, she would describe seeing things in her room at night, shadowy figures, animals that walked like men, and 2 old women standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with cold, knowing eyes. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender. Jane had never met either woman. She didn't know what they looked like, but when her mother took her through the village and asked her to point out the witches, Jane walked directly to Amy Duny and Rose Cullender and identified them without hesitation. How did she know? How could she recognize women she had never seen before? The answer, to everyone in the village, was obvious. The demons had shown her. The demons that the witches commanded had appeared to Jane in her visions and revealed their masters' faces. Then came the vomiting. Not just pins, but nails, pieces of glass, bent needles, buttons, bits of straw, objects that no child could have swallowed without severe injury, yet they came up seemingly without effort, without blood, without damage to the throat. Elizabeth Pacy would go into a fit, and her family would hold a basin under her mouth as she expelled dozens of pins, one after another, in an impossible stream. Deborah, the younger sister, would suddenly gag and produce a nail, a long, rusty iron nail that should have killed her if it had truly been in her stomach. Jane Bocking vomited a large iron hook, the kind used for hanging meat. It was bent and corroded, as if it had been inside her body for years. The village doctor, a man trained in the medical knowledge of the time, examined the objects. He examined the girls' throats, looking for cuts, for swelling, for any sign that they had been forcing these objects down. He found nothing. Their throats were clear. Their stomachs, when he pressed on them, showed no sign of containing metal. It was medically impossible, which meant it was supernaturally certain. The girls were not swallowing these objects. The objects were being placed inside them by demonic forces, and then expelled as a sign of the witch's power. More children began to fall victim. Susan Chandler, age 18, Anne Durant, age 10, Margaret Arnold, age 11, all from different families, all with the same symptoms: fits, convulsions, temporary blindness and deafness, the sensation of being choked or burned, vomiting impossible objects, and always the same accusation. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were doing this. The demons they commanded were tormenting the children. Some of the girls claimed they could see the witches' imps, the demonic familiars that served them. They described them in vivid detail: a black dog with eyes like fire, a white cat that spoke in a human voice, a toad that would sit on their chests and suffocate them. These descriptions matched exactly what English witch lore said familiars should look like. The girls, most of whom were uneducated and couldn't read, somehow knew the precise details of demonic companions as described in witch hunting manuals. How did they know? Either they had been taught, coached by adults who wanted to see the old women punished, or the demons themselves were real and the girls were genuinely possessed. The village authorities leaned toward the latter explanation. In late March 1662, the magistrate issued warrants for the arrest of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender. The constables came to their cottages in the early morning, before dawn. They wanted to catch the witches before they could flee or perform some dark ritual to protect themselves. Amy Duny was dragged from her bed, confused and terrified. She was in her nightclothes, her grey hair loose and wild. She protested her innocence, shouting that she had done nothing wrong, that she was a good Christian woman. The constables ignored her. They bound her hands and led her through the village, where a crowd had already gathered. People shouted at her. Some threw stones. Someone spat in her face. "Witch!" they screamed. "Devil's whore! Child killer!" Amy kept her head down and said nothing. Rose Cullender was arrested at the same time. She was older, frailer than Amy. The constables found her kneeling by her bed, praying. She looked up at them with watery, frightened eyes and asked what she had done. "You've been accused of witchcraft," the constable said. "You're to be examined and held for trial." Rose's hands shook as they bound them. She whispered prayers under her breath as they led her out of her cottage and through the hostile crowd. Both women were taken to the village jail, a small, dark stone building with a single cell. They were locked inside together, the iron door slamming shut with a sound of finality. They would remain there for weeks, awaiting examination, awaiting trial. While outside their cell, the children continued to convulse and vomit and scream about demons. Before a witch could be tried, she had to be examined. This was standard procedure in witch cases. The examination had two purposes: to search for physical evidence of witchcraft and to extract a confession. The examination of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender took place in a private room conducted by a panel of local women. Male authorities were not allowed to be present for the physical search, as it involved stripping the accused naked and inspecting every inch of their bodies. What were they looking for? Witches' marks. These were believed to be physical signs of a pact with the devil, spots on the skin where a demon familiar would suckle, drawing blood to sustain itself. A witch's mark could be a mole, a birthmark, a scar, any discoloration or unusual feature. And everyone has something unusual on their skin. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were stripped naked in a cold room while a group of village women examined them. They prodded at moles, pinched skin, searched between fingers and toes, looked in the most private areas of their bodies, and they found what they were looking for. Amy had a dark mole on her thigh. Rose had a small growth near her genitals. Both were declared witches' marks, proof of their demonic pact. The women conducting the examination also performed another test. They pricked the marks with a pin. In witch lore, a true witch's mark would not bleed and would not cause pain because it was insensate tissue created by the devil. Amy flinched and bled when pricked, but the examiners decided she was pretending, using her witch's power to simulate a normal reaction. Rose, elderly and terrified, barely reacted when pricked, not because she was a witch, but because she was in shock, numb with fear. The examiners declared this proof of her guilt. There was no way to pass the test. Reaction or no reaction, bleeding or no bleeding, the conclusion was the same. These women were witches. The magistrate and local officials visited the women in their cell multiple times, trying to extract confessions. In witch trials, a confession was the gold standard of evidence. If a witch confessed, the case was closed. She would be executed, and everyone could sleep soundly knowing the evil had been rooted out. But Amy Duny and Rose Cullender refused to confess. "I am no witch," Amy said over and over. "I have never harmed a child. I have never spoken to the devil. I am a Christian woman. I pray every day." Rose wept and begged them to believe her. "I am old," she said. "I am weak. I could not harm anyone even if I wanted to. Please, please believe me. I have done nothing." The officials were frustrated. They needed a confession. They tried various methods: threats, promises of mercy if they confessed, warnings that their refusal only proved their guilt. But the women would not break. In some witch trials, at this point, torture would be applied. England was technically more restrained than continental Europe in this regard. Torture was not supposed to be used to extract confessions, but there were ways around that: sleep deprivation, starvation, walking the accused, forcing them to stay on their feet for days until exhaustion broke their will. There's no direct evidence that Amy and Rose were tortured, but they were held in terrible conditions for weeks, cold, dark, poorly fed, constantly harassed by officials demanding confession, and through it all, they maintained their innocence, which, to the authorities, only proved how powerful and dangerous they were. Only a witch in deep league with the devil could resist confession for so long. While Amy Duny and Rose Cullender sat in their cell, the children's condition worsened. Elizabeth Pacy had now gone completely blind. Her eyes were open, but she could see nothing. Doctors examined her and found no physical cause. The blindness had come on suddenly during one of her fits and showed no sign of reversing. Deborah Pacy had stopped eating entirely. Her parents tried to force food into her mouth, but she would gag and spit it out. She was wasting away, her body growing thinner by the day, and the fits had spread beyond the original victims. Now, nearly a dozen children in the area were experiencing similar symptoms. The entire region was gripped by panic. Parents kept their children indoors. They hung iron horseshoes over doorways. Iron was believed to ward off witches. They made their children wear protective charms and recite prayers before bed. But nothing worked. The demons were too strong. The witch's power was too great. Samuel Pacy, desperate to save his daughters, made a decision. This case was too important for a local trial. Too many children were affected. This needed to go to the highest court in the region. He petitioned for the case to be moved to the assizes, the traveling circuit court presided over by judges appointed by the king himself. The trial of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender would not be a small village affair. It would be a major event, held in the town of Bury St. Edmunds, with a judge who had the authority to sentence the accused to death. And the judge who would preside over this trial was a man named Sir Matthew Hale, one of the most respected legal minds in England, a devout Christian and a firm believer in the reality of witchcraft. The trial was set for March 1662, and when it began, it would become one of the most influential witch trials in English history, a case that would be cited for decades as proof that witches were real and that the testimony of possessed children was reliable evidence. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender, two poor old women who had never hurt anyone, were about to face a justice system that had already decided they were guilty. The only question was how long the trial would take before they were sentenced to hang. The town of Bury St. Edmunds was larger and more important than the small villages where Amy and Rose had lived. It had a grand courthouse, a marketplace, and a permanent gallows that stood in the town square as a reminder of the king's justice. On March 13th, 1662, the courthouse was packed. Every seat was filled. People stood in the aisles, crowded around the doors, pressed against the windows. This was the trial everyone had been waiting for. The trial of the witches. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were led into the courtroom in chains. They looked small, frail, and terrified. Two old women in ragged clothes, their faces pale from weeks in a dark cell. The crowd jeered at them. Someone threw something, a piece of rotten fruit that splattered against Rose's shoulder. The bailiffs shouted for order, but the hostility in the room was palpable. Presiding over the trial was Sir Matthew Hale, Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer. He was one of the most respected judges in England, known for his fairness, his intelligence, and his deep Christian faith. He was also a firm believer in witchcraft. Hale had written extensively on the subject. He believed that denying the existence of witches was denying the truth of Scripture. He believed that demonic possession was real, that the devil walked the earth, and that witches were his servants. This was not a judge who would be skeptical of the accusations. This was a judge who was predisposed to believe every word the accusers said. The trial began. The first witnesses were the children themselves. Elizabeth and Deborah Pacy were brought into the courtroom. Elizabeth was led by the hand, her eyes open but unseeing. The blindness that had struck her during her possession still afflicted her. Deborah was carried, too weak to walk on her own. The sight of them shocked the courtroom. These were clearly suffering children. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin. Whatever was happening to them, it was real. Samuel Pacy testified first, describing his daughter's symptoms in detail. The fits, the vomiting of pins and nails, the blindness, the inability to eat. He held up a bowl filled with the objects his daughters had expelled. Dozens of bent pins, nails, shards of glass. He passed the bowl to Judge Hale, who examined the contents carefully. The judge was visibly disturbed. Then Elizabeth was asked to testify. She could not see, but she could speak. In a quiet, trembling voice, she described the women who had tormented her. "Two old women," she said. "They come to my room at night. They stand at the foot of my bed with their demons, a black dog, a white cat. They command the demons to choke me, to hurt me. They laugh while I suffer." "Can you name these women?" the prosecutor asked. "Amy Duny," Elizabeth said, "and Rose Cullender." The crowd murmured. The two accused women sat silently, their faces showing nothing but fear. Then came the other children. Jane Bocking, Susan Chandler, Anne Durrent. One by one, they took the stand and told the same story. The witches appeared to them. The witches commanded demons. The witches caused their suffering. The consistency of the testimonies was compelling. These children, from different families, who had never met before, were all saying the same thing. How could that be explained if it wasn't true? But Judge Hale, despite his belief in witchcraft, was still a careful jurist. He wanted to test the children's claims. He wanted to be sure they were genuinely possessed and not simply making false accusations. So he devised an experiment. One of the afflicted girls, Jane Bocking, was brought before the court. She was in the middle of one of her fits, convulsing and crying out that she was being choked by invisible hands. Judge Hale ordered that Amy Duny be brought forward. Then he had a woman from the court, a stranger to Jane, stand next to Amy, dressed similarly, partially obscured so Jane could not clearly see her face. "Touch her," the judge said to Jane. "Touch the woman who is tormenting you." In witch lore, it was believed that a possessed person would immediately recognize their tormentor, even without seeing them clearly. The demon inside them would know its master. Jane, still convulsing, reached out her hand and touched Amy Duny. Immediately, her fit stopped. She went calm, as if a switch had been flipped. The courtroom gasped. This was proof. The possessed girl had identified the witch through supernatural knowledge. The demon had recognized Amy. But then Judge Hale did something clever. He repeated the experiment. This time, he had the stranger stand in front of Jane, and Amy was moved aside, hidden from view. "Touch her," the judge said again. Jane, still believing she was touching Amy, reached out and touched the stranger, and immediately, she went into another fit, screaming, convulsing, claiming the witch was torturing her, but she was touching the wrong person. Judge Hale frowned. This suggested the girl was not actually sensing the witch supernaturally. She was simply reacting to what she thought was happening. But before he could pursue this line of questioning further, something else happened that changed everything. As the trial continued, Elizabeth Pacy, who had been sitting quietly beside her father, suddenly let out a terrible scream. She fell from her chair, her body rigid, her blind eyes staring at nothing. Her mouth opened wide, and she began to choke, her hands clawing at her throat as if invisible fingers were strangling her. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People stood, shouted, pointed at the two accused women. "The witches are attacking her!" someone screamed. "They're killing her right here in the courtroom!" Samuel Pacy grabbed his daughter, trying to hold her, trying to stop the convulsions. But she was impossibly strong, thrashing in his arms. And then she went limp, completely limp, not breathing. For a moment, everyone thought she was dead. Samuel Pacy screamed his daughter's name, shaking her, begging her to wake up. The court physician rushed forward, checking for a pulse, for breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, her breathing returned. She gasped, her eyes opened, still blind, and she whispered, "They tried to kill me." The witches. They tried to stop me from testifying. The courtroom was silent. Even Judge Hale, the careful jurist, looked shaken. This was too powerful to be a performance. This was not a coached child. This was a genuine attack, happening in real time, in front of dozens of witnesses. The witches had just proven their power, and they had done it in the king's own courtroom. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender had no lawyer. In 1662, the accused in a criminal trial were expected to defend themselves. And these were poor, uneducated women facing charges they barely understood. They tried to speak. They tried to defend themselves. Amy stood and addressed the court. Her voice was shaking, but firm. "I have done nothing," she said. "I have never met most of these children. I have never spoken to the devil. I have never commanded demons. I am a Christian woman. I pray every day. I beg you to believe me." Rose, weeping, added her own plea. "I am old. I am weak. How could I do these things? How could I have this power? I have nothing. I am nothing. Please, have mercy." But their words fell on deaf ears. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The children's testimony, the witches' marks found on their bodies, the pins and nails, the fits happening in the courtroom itself. And then the prosecutor brought forward his final, most damning piece of evidence: expert testimony. Several doctors were called to testify. They had examined the children. They had examined the objects vomited up, and they had no natural explanation for what was happening. One doctor testified, "I have practiced medicine for 20 years. I have never seen an illness that presents like this. The children's symptoms do not match any known disease. The objects they expel could not have been swallowed without causing severe injury, yet their throats show no damage. This is beyond the power of medicine to explain." Another doctor added, "In my professional opinion, these children are not ill. They are afflicted by a supernatural force. This is not a matter for medicine. This is a matter for the church." Then came the clergy. Several ministers testified that they had witnessed the children's fits. They had prayed over them, performed blessings, attempted to drive out the demons, but nothing had worked. One minister said, "I believe these children are possessed by demons sent by the accused." The consistency of their testimony, the supernatural strength they display during fits, the objects they produce, these are all signs of demonic influence. And demons do not act on their own. They must be commanded by a human agent. A witch. This was the final blow. Medicine and religion the two authorities on matters of body and soul, had both agreed. This was witchcraft. Judge Hale listened carefully to all the testimony. He took notes. He asked questions. And then he turned to the jury and delivered his instructions. Sir Matthew Hale's speech to the jury would be recorded and cited in witch trials for decades to come. It was a masterclass in legal reasoning that led directly to the execution of two innocent women. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you have heard the testimony of the afflicted children. You have seen with your own eyes the fits they suffer. You have heard the medical experts state that no natural cause can explain their condition. You have heard the ministers confirm that these are symptoms of demonic possession. There are those who doubt the existence of witchcraft. There are those who say it is superstition, old wives' tales, primitive belief. But I say to you, to deny the existence of witches is to deny the truth of Holy Scripture itself. The Bible speaks plainly of witches. Exodus commands us not to suffer a witch to live. King Saul consulted the witch of Endor. Jesus Christ himself cast out demons. If we deny that witches exist, we deny the Word of God. And if we deny the Word of God, we invite chaos and heresy into our land. I have studied the law for 30 years. I have presided over many trials. And I tell you now, with absolute certainty, witchcraft is real. Demons are real. And those who make pacts with the devil to command those demons are real. You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. The question before you is simple. Are Amy Duny and Rose Cullender guilty of the crime of witchcraft? Did they, through demonic power, cause the suffering of these children? Consider the facts. Multiple children from different families all tell the same story. They name the same two women. They describe the same demons. The children have no reason to lie. They gain nothing from false accusation. Indeed, their suffering is genuine and ongoing. Consider the objects produced from their bodies. Pins, nails, glass. No natural process can explain this. Only supernatural intervention. Consider the witches' marks found on the bodies of the accused. Physical evidence of their pact with Satan. Consider the timing. The children's afflictions began after encounters with the accused. Cause and effect, action and consequence. And consider what you saw with your own eyes in this very courtroom. Elizabeth Pacy, attacked by invisible forces while the accused sat before her. Could this be coincidence? Or was it the witches, desperate to silence their accuser, demonstrating their power even in the presence of the king's justice? Gentlemen, the evidence is clear, the law is clear. If you find that these women did willfully and maliciously use witchcraft to harm these children, then you must find them guilty. And if you find them guilty, the sentence prescribed by law is death. Go now and deliberate. Search your consciences and render a verdict that upholds the law of England and the Word of God. The jury filed out. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender sat in the dock, holding hands, both women quietly weeping. The deliberation lasted 30 minutes. The jury returned. The foreman stood. Judge Hale asked the question that would seal the women's fate. Have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of witchcraft, how do you find the defendants, Amy Duny and Rose Cullender? The foreman looked at the two old women. Then he looked at the judge, and he spoke the word that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting to hear. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered. Some wept with relief. The parents of the afflicted children embraced, thanking God that justice had been served. Amy Duny let out a wail of despair. Rose Cullender simply collapsed, her body going limp in her chair. Judge Hale waited for silence, then spoke the sentence. Amy Duny, Rose Cullender, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the crime of witchcraft. You have used demonic powers to torment innocent children. You have made pacts with Satan. You have brought evil into this Christian land. The sentence for witchcraft is death by hanging. You will be taken from this place to the prison, and from there to the gallows, where you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy on your souls, though you showed no mercy to your victims. The gavel came down. The trial was over. Amy and Rose were dragged from the courtroom, still protesting their innocence, their voices drowned out by the crowd's celebration. Justice had been served. The witches had been caught. The children would be saved. But would they? The execution was set for 2 days later. In that time, priests visited Amy Duny and Rose Cullender in their cell, urging them to confess, to repent, to save their souls, even if their bodies were forfeit. But the women would not confess, even facing the gallows, even knowing that confession might bring some measure of peace or absolution. They maintained their innocence. "I am no witch," Amy said for the 100th time. "I will die saying this. I am innocent. God knows I am innocent." Rose was too weak to speak much. She simply prayed, her lips moving in silent devotion, tears streaming down her face. On the morning of the execution, they were led through the streets of Bury St. Edmunds to the town square. A crowd of thousands had gathered. Executions were public spectacles, and a witch execution was the biggest spectacle of all. The gallows stood in the center of the square, 2 nooses swaying in the wind. Amy and Rose were made to climb the steps. The executioner placed the nooses around their necks. A priest offered final prayers, and then the trapdoors opened. The 2 women dropped. Their necks snapped. And Amy Duny and Rose Cullender, convicted of witchcraft on the testimony of children and the belief of a nation, were dead. The crowd cheered. Justice had been done. The evil had been purged. The children would recover now. The demons would flee. God's order had been restored. But as the body swung from the gallows, a question hung in the air, unspoken by the celebrating crowd, but whispered by history. What if they were innocent? What if the children had been lying, or ill, or coached? What if the pins were swallowed deliberately or planted by adults? What if the fits were seizures, or hysteria, or performance? What if Amy Duny and Rose Cullender had been 2 harmless old women, murdered by a legal system that confused superstition with evidence, fear with justice, and the testimony of children with the word of God? And more terrifying still, if 2 innocent women could be executed on such flimsy evidence, how many others had died the same way? How many other witches had been hanged, burned, or drowned across England, across Europe, across the centuries? The answer, as history would eventually reveal, was in the thousands. But in March 1662, in Bury St. Edmunds, no one was asking these questions. They were too busy celebrating the defeat of evil. The witches were dead. The children would recover, and England could sleep soundly, knowing that the devil's servants had been destroyed, or so they believed. In the days following the execution, the people of Lowestoft and Bury St. Edmunds waited for the miracle they had been promised. The witches were dead. The demons had been defeated. Now, surely, the children would recover. Elizabeth Pacy's blindness would be cured. Deborah would regain her strength. The fits would stop. The vomiting would cease. Life would return to normal. But that's not what happened. Elizabeth Pacy remained blind. Her sight, stolen during her possession, never returned. She would live the rest of her life in darkness, dependent on her family, unable to work, unable to marry, a living testament to whatever had happened to her in the spring of 1662. Deborah's health improved somewhat. The fits became less frequent, but she remained weak, sickly, never quite recovering the vitality she'd had before the possession began. Jane Bocking's symptoms eventually faded, though she would experience occasional fits for years afterward. Some of the other children recovered fully, some did not. There was no pattern, no consistency. If the witches' deaths had truly broken the spell, all the children should have recovered immediately, but they didn't, which raised an uncomfortable question that few people wanted to ask. Had the witches actually been responsible at all? But asking that question meant confronting a terrible possibility, that 2 innocent women had been executed, that the justice system had failed, that judges, juries, doctors, and ministers had all been wrong. It was easier not to ask. Easier to say that the witches had been particularly powerful, that their curses had been so strong that even death couldn't completely undo them. Easier to move on and forget. And so that's what most people did. But the trial of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender was not forgotten by everyone. In fact, it became one of the most cited witch trials in English legal history. Judge Matthew Hale's instructions to the jury were published and distributed. They became a model for how to conduct witch trials. His reasoning that denying the existence of witches was denying scripture, that the consistency of children's testimony was proof of truth, that physical evidence like witches' marks and vomited objects was reliable, became standard legal doctrine. The case was used to justify dozens of other witch trials across England in the following decades. When judges, juries, or skeptics questioned whether witchcraft was real, prosecutors would point to the Bury St. Edmunds case as proof. Look at the evidence, they would say. Look at the children's testimony. Look at what Judge Hale himself concluded. One of the finest legal minds in England confirmed that witchcraft is real and that possessed children can identify their tormentors. The case was even cited 30 years later during the Salem Witch Trials in Massachusetts. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister who played a key role in those trials, referenced the Bury St. Edmunds case in his writings. He used it as evidence that children's testimony in witch trials should be believed, that fits and possessions were real signs of demonic activity. The ripple effects of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender's execution spread across the Atlantic and contributed to the deaths of 20 people in Salem. 2 old women, hanged in a small English town, became the foundation for a legacy of legal murder that would span continents and decades. So what was really happening to the children of Lowestoft in the spring of 1662? Modern historians and medical professionals have proposed several theories, none of them involving actual witchcraft or demonic possession. Theory 1. Mass hysteria. Mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria, is a well-documented phenomenon. It occurs when a group of people, usually in a close community, begin to exhibit similar psychological or physical symptoms without any underlying medical cause. The symptoms are real. The people genuinely experience pain, convulsions, illness, but they are psychosomatic, created by the mind rather than by disease. In a small, isolated, deeply religious community like 17th century Lowestoft, the suggestion that witchcraft was occurring could have been enough to trigger such an episode. One child falls ill, claims she's been bewitched, and suddenly other children begin experiencing similar symptoms. The expectation of possession creates the experience of possession. The vomiting of pins and nails could be explained by deliberate swallowing, not as a trick, but as a compulsion. People experiencing hysterical episodes sometimes engage in self-harm or dangerous behaviors without fully understanding why. A child, convinced she is possessed, might swallow small objects, believing that the demon made her do it. And in the chaos and fear of the moment, no one would notice her doing it. Theory 2. Epilepsy and other medical conditions. Some of the symptoms, the convulsions, the temporary blindness and deafness, the rigidity, are consistent with epilepsy, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause seizures accompanied by hallucinations and altered consciousness. In the 1600s, there was no understanding of epilepsy as a neurological condition. Seizures were seen as either divine punishment or demonic possession. A child having an epileptic seizure would be terrifying to witness, and the explanation that fit the cultural framework was witchcraft. Other conditions, brain tumors, infections, even vitamin deficiencies, could also cause some of the reported symptoms. Theory 3. Fraud and coaching. This is the darkest possibility, but one that cannot be dismissed. Some historians believe that at least some of the children were lying, either on their own or with the encouragement of adults. Why would children lie about being possessed? There are several possible motivations. Attention. In a world where children were largely invisible and powerless, claiming possession made them the center of attention. Adults listened to them. Important people cared about their words. Revenge. Some of the children's families had conflicts with Amy Duny or Rose Cullender. Accusing them of witchcraft was a way to punish enemies while appearing to be victims. Pressure. Parents, ministers, or community leaders might have coached the children, either deliberately or unconsciously, leading questions like, "Did you see an old woman in your room?" Or, "Was it Amy Duny who hurt you?" could plant suggestions that children would then repeat. The fact that the children's testimonies were so consistent could actually be evidence of coaching rather than truth. If multiple children are being asked the same leading questions and given the same cultural script about what demon possession looks like, they will naturally give similar answers. The vomiting of objects is harder to explain as fraud, but not impossible. In other historical cases of miraculous vomiting, investigation has revealed that the objects were being inserted into the mouth during the performance or had been swallowed earlier. With everyone focused on the drama of the fit itself, a child could manipulate small objects without being noticed. Theory 4. A combination. The most likely explanation is that multiple factors were at play. Perhaps Elizabeth Pacy genuinely had epilepsy or another medical condition. Her family, desperate for an explanation, interpreted it as possession. Other children, hearing about Elizabeth's case, began to experience psychosomatic symptoms through mass hysteria. Adults, terrified by what was happening, began asking leading questions that shaped the children's narratives, and a few children, seeing the power that claiming possession gave them, deliberately exaggerated or invented symptoms. All of these factors swirling together in a community that deeply believed in witches and demons created the perfect storm that killed Amy Duny and Rose Cullender. But regardless of what actually caused the children's symptoms, one thing is certain: Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were innocent. They did not command demons. They did not make pacts with Satan. They did not torment children through supernatural means. They were two poor, elderly women who were scapegoated by a community in crisis. They were victims of a legal system that accepted supernatural explanations as evidence. They were killed by a culture that feared the powerless and gave that fear a monstrous face. And they were not alone. Between 1400 and 1800, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. The vast majority were women. The vast majority were poor, elderly, or socially marginal. And the vast majority were almost certainly innocent of any actual crime. The witch trials were not about justice. They were about control. Control over women, control over the poor, control over anyone who didn't fit neatly into society's expectations. Witchcraft accusations were weapons used to eliminate the inconvenient, the troublesome, the different. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were not monsters. They were victims. And their story, like the stories of thousands of other executed witches, is a reminder of what happens when fear, superstition, and power combine to create a system of legal murder. But there is one question that no rational explanation can fully answer. One detail that continues to disturb historians and researchers who study this case. The pins. Dozens of witnesses, parents, doctors, court officials, watched the children vomit pins and nails. These were not stage magicians or con artists. They were respectable members of the community with no reason to lie. Some of the objects were collected and examined. They were real. They existed. They came out of the children's mouths. How? The most logical explanation is that the children swallowed them. But when? Why? How did they obtain so many pins without anyone noticing? How did they swallow large nails without injury? And why would they do it? What would motivate children, some as young as 9 years old, to swallow dangerous metal objects to maintain a lie? There are answers to these questions. Psychological compulsion, access to sewing supplies, careful staging when adults weren't looking. But none of the answers feel completely satisfying, which leaves us with an uncomfortable space between rational explanation and impossible mystery. A space where we can see that witchcraft wasn't real, that demons didn't exist, that Amy and Rose were innocent, but where we also can't quite explain every detail of what happened. And perhaps that's the real horror of the Bury St. Edmunds witch trials. Not that demons possessed children, but that something, whether it was illness or hysteria or lies or some combination we still don't fully understand, convinced an entire community to kill 2 innocent women, and that we, looking back across centuries of progress and enlightenment, still can't say with absolute certainty exactly what that something was. The bodies of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were cut down from the gallows and buried in unmarked graves. Their property, what little they had, was seized by the state. Their names were recorded in the trial documents as convicted witches, criminals, servants of Satan. But their story didn't end there. In the years following the execution, strange reports began to emerge from Bury St. Edmunds. People claimed to see two old women walking the streets at night, near the site of the old gallows. They would appear and disappear like mist. They never spoke. They just watched. Were they ghosts? The restless spirits of Amy and Rose, unable to find peace after their unjust deaths? Or were they living women, other widows and outcasts, whom superstitious townspeople mistook for spectral visitors? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: the site of the gallows where Amy and Rose died became a place people avoided after dark. Local legend said the ground was cursed, that nothing would grow there, that animals refused to walk across it. And in a final, bitter irony, children in Bury St. Edmunds began to tell each other stories about the witch ghosts who haunted the town square. They would dare each other to run past the cursed spot at night. They would frighten each other with tales of old women who grabbed disobedient children and dragged them to hell. The witches, Amy Duny and Rose Cullender, had never been in life, became the monsters they were remembered as in death. The innocent women were transformed by fear and folklore into the very demons they had been falsely accused of serving. And so the lie lived on. The injustice compounded. Two women killed by superstition became the foundation for more superstition, more fear, more accusations, more deaths. The demons were never real, but the damage they caused, the lives destroyed, the women murdered, the terror unleashed, that was very real indeed, and it would continue in England and beyond for another 100 years before the witch trials finally, mercifully, came to an end. The story of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender is not a story about witches. It's not a story about demons or possession or supernatural evil. It's a story about us, about what humans do when we're afraid, about what we're capable of when we're desperate for explanations, for control, for someone to blame. The children of Lowestoft were suffering. That much seems clear. Something was happening to them. But instead of seeking patient, careful understanding, the adults around them reached for the easiest explanation. Witches, evil, the devil's work. And once that explanation was accepted, once the community agreed that supernatural forces were at play, two old women were as good as dead. Because in a world that believes in demons, someone has to be punished for demonic acts. And it's always easier to punish the powerless. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were poor. They were old. They were women without male protection. They were strange, solitary, the kind of people communities have always feared and always targeted. They never had a chance. The trial was not about evidence. It was about confirming what everyone already believed. The judge, the jury, the witnesses, they all knew Amy and Rose were guilty before the trial even began. The proceedings were just theatre, a ritual to sanctify what was already decided. And the demons everyone feared, they were never in Amy or Rose. The demons were in the system that killed them, in the judges who confused faith with fact, in the doctors who declared the inexplicable to be supernatural, in the parents who coached their children, in the crowd that cheered at the execution. The demons were human. They always have been. Judge Matthew Hale, the man who sentenced Amy and Rose to death, is still celebrated in legal circles as one of the great jurists of English history. His name appears on law schools, courthouses, legal treatises. He's remembered as a brilliant mind, a fair judge, a man of principle. But he killed 2 innocent women based on the vomit of children and the superstitions of his age. How many other great men of history have similar blood on their hands? How many monuments celebrate killers? How many legal precedents are built on injustice? The Bury St. Edmunds witch trials ended in 1662, but the impulse that drove them, the need to find monsters to explain our fears, to punish the outsider, to accept convenient lies over difficult truths, that impulse is still with us. We don't hunt witches anymore, but we still hunt. We still look for scapegoats. We still let fear override reason. We still listen to those in power when they tell us who to blame for our suffering. The faces change. The accusations change. But the pattern remains. And somewhere, in an unmarked grave in Bury St. Edmunds, 2 old women rest. Forgotten by most, remembered by a few as a cautionary tale. They were not witches. They were not demons. They were human beings with lives and hopes and fears of their own. And they were murdered for crimes they did not commit by a system that called it justice. If there's a lesson in their story, it's this: the demons are not hiding in the shadows, waiting to possess us. The demons are inside us, waiting for permission to emerge, and all they need is fear and certainty and the belief that we are righteous in our cruelty. Amy Duny and Rose Cullender tried to tell everyone they were innocent. They maintained it until the very end. They died on the gallows proclaiming their truth, and no one believed them. Because we never believe the victims when it's more convenient to believe in monsters. What do you think happened in Lowestoft in 1662? Were the children genuinely possessed by something we still don't understand? Were they suffering from illness misinterpreted as supernatural? Or were they lying, coached by adults who wanted to see 2 helpless women destroyed? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the darkest corners of history compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten cases, the miscarriages of justice, the horror stories that are all the more terrifying because they actually happened. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for walking with us through this dark chapter of history. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous monsters are the ones we create ourselves. This has been the Midnight Archives.